Welcome, friend, to another journey together. We're so glad to have you here. Tonight, you will discover 25 calming Buddhist tales that reveal the keys to complete relaxation and inner peace. Secrets that have guided seekers to tranquility for over 1,000 years. If you'd like, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. I'm about to share with you a carefully chosen collection of Zen wisdom that reveals the most guarded secrets from ancient masters. Each tale contains a teaching that can beautifully transform how you experience worry, restlessness, and the endless cycles of thought that keep you awake at night. These aren't just stories to pass the time. They're passed down lessons from those who discovered something remarkable. That complete mental relaxation comes not from silencing the world outside us, but from understanding the true nature of our own minds. The Buddha taught us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Tonight, you will uncover exactly what this profound truth means for your own journey to return to your natural state of peace and wisdom. As we move through these calming teachings, you'll feel something beautiful begin to unfold. The weight of your concerns will start to dissolve. The restlessness that keeps you turning will begin to settle. You'll find yourself naturally drifting into a state of peace that reaches the very core of your being. So let yourself sink deeply now. Let your entire being relax into whatever holds you. Take one mindful breath with me, and as you release it, know that you're about to receive ancient wisdom that has been helping people for thousands of years. Let us explore a Zen story about creative compassion and the unexpected ways wisdom can serve practical human needs. This is the magical squash. The year had brought unusual hardship to the Hakata region. A cholera epidemic had swept through the area like wildfire, leaving communities paralyzed with fear and confusion about how the deadly disease spread and what could prevent it. In the midst of this crisis, old superstitions and desperate theories flourished as people grasped for any sense of control over their frightening circumstances. Among those affected by the epidemic's economic impact was the head of Hapiakuya, a merchant house that had made what seemed like a shrewd business decision earlier in the year. Anticipating high demand for squash during the harvest season, the merchant had invested heavily, purchasing enormous quantities of the vegetable from local farmers. Under normal circumstances, this investment would have yielded substantial profits. But these were far from normal circumstances. As fear of cholera spread through the community, a rumor began circulating that eating squash would increase one's susceptibility to the disease. Whether this belief arose from some misunderstood medical advice or simply from the panic that accompanies epidemic disease, it took hold with devastating effectiveness. Suddenly, no one would buy squash at any price. The merchant, watching his investment rot and his family's financial future crumble, arrived at Master Sengai's temple in obvious distress. "Your Reverence," he said, his voice heavy with desperation. "This year I expected big profits from squash, so I bought up huge quantities. But now people believe that eating squash will give them cholera, and nobody is purchasing anything. If I can't sell these vegetables, my family will be ruined financially. Please, you must help me." Master Sengai listened with genuine concern to the man's predicament. Here was a concrete human problem requiring immediate practical solution, not abstract philosophical discussion. "That's really terrible," he said, with sincere sympathy. "Very well, I'll become your business manager and help you sell them. Please bring all your squash here to the temple." The merchant was bewildered by this unexpected offer. What could the Zen master possibly have in mind? How could a spiritual teacher succeed in selling vegetables that the entire community refused to buy? Nevertheless, having no better options, he dutifully loaded all his remaining squash onto carts and transported them to Shofukuji Temple. Master Sengai's solution was both brilliant and audacious. He piled all the vegetables prominently in front of the temple's main gate, where they couldn't be missed by anyone approaching the sacred grounds. Then he created a large sign with bold characters that read, "Magical Cholera Prevention Squash." Spreading his meditation mat alongside this impressive display, he sat down and began practicing zazen in full view of anyone passing by. The effect was immediate and remarkable. Word of the master's magical squash spread throughout the district with the same speed that the cholera fear had initially propagated. People began arriving from all directions, eager to purchase vegetables that were now perceived as protective medicine rather than dangerous food. The sight of the revered Zen master meditating beside his display added an aura of authentic spiritual authority to the entire enterprise. By noon, every single squash had been sold, and the merchant's financial crisis had been completely resolved. The firm of Hapiakuya was not only saved from ruin, but had actually profited more from this unusual marketing approach than they would have through conventional sales methods. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, skillful means adapts truth to the needs of the moment. What emerges from this story is a teaching about the creative application of wisdom to serve immediate human needs, even when this requires working with people's existing beliefs and limitations, rather than trying to educate them out of their misconceptions. This tale unveils something profound about the nature of compassionate action. Master Sengai could have responded to the merchant's crisis by delivering lectures about the irrationality of superstition, the importance of critical thinking, or the spiritual value of accepting financial loss with equanimity. Instead, he chose to work creatively within the existing situation to produce genuine relief for immediate suffering. The master's willingness to become a business manager reveals an understanding of spiritual practice that extends far beyond formal meditation and philosophical discussion. True wisdom expresses itself through whatever means are most effective for addressing real human problems, even if these means might appear unconventional or even contradictory to conventional spiritual image. Why do we often assume that spiritual people should remain aloof from practical concerns, especially those involving money and business? This assumption reflects a false dichotomy between sacred and secular activities that can prevent us from applying our deepest values to the situations where they're most needed. Master Sengai understood that relieving genuine suffering takes precedence over maintaining spiritual appearances. The genius of his solution lay in understanding that the community's fear was real and powerful, regardless of its medical accuracy. Rather than fighting against this fear or trying to educate people out of it, he redirected its energy toward a solution that served everyone's needs. The people got vegetables they believed would protect them, the merchant saved his business, and the community's overall nutrition actually improved. This teaching illuminates the difference between being right and being effective. The master probably understood that squash had no special power to prevent cholera, but he also recognized that arguing this point would have done nothing to solve the immediate crisis. By working with people's existing beliefs rather than against them, he achieved results that pure logic never could have accomplished. Zen practice cultivates what might be called adaptive wisdom, the ability to respond to each situation with whatever approach will be most genuinely helpful, rather than rigidly applying the same methods regardless of context. This requires a kind of ego flexibility that prioritizes outcomes over self-image, effectiveness over consistency. We can observe similar opportunities for creative problem-solving in many areas of modern life. The therapist who works with a client's existing framework, rather than insisting they adopt new therapeutic language. The teacher who meets students where they are emotionally and intellectually, rather than demanding they immediately embrace ideal learning attitudes. The leader who acknowledges team members' concerns, rather than dismissing them as irrational. This story also points us toward understanding the power of symbolic action and ritual in creating psychological change. The master's meditation beside the squash display wasn't just marketing theater. It was a genuine spiritual practice that infused the entire situation with sacred intention and authentic presence. Additionally, our minds tend to separate spiritual practice from practical problem solving, as if wisdom should only concern itself with eternal matters rather than immediate needs. Master Sengai's story demonstrates that authentic spirituality engages fully with whatever challenges arise, bringing creative intelligence and compassionate action to bear on concrete human difficulties. The transformation of dangerous squash into magical squash reveals another teaching about the power of framing and perception in determining reality. The vegetables themselves remained unchanged, but their meaning and impact shifted completely through the master's creative intervention. This suggests that many of our problems might be solved not by changing external circumstances, but by shifting how we understand and present them. Tonight, as you consider challenges in your own life or community, can you identify situations where creative reframing or working with existing beliefs might be more effective than direct confrontation or logical argument? What would it mean to prioritize genuine helpfulness over being right or maintaining ideal consistency? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, if you want to know your past, look at your present. If you want to know your future, change your present. Through skillful, creative action that meets people where they are, rather than where we think they should be, we can transform seemingly impossible situations into opportunities for genuine benefit and mutual flourishing. Our next story reveals a profound teaching about the burdens we carry in our minds. This is Muddy Road. Two Zen monks, Tanzan and Ekido, were traveling together along a country road after several days of heavy spring rain. The path they followed was one they had walked many times before, but today it was transformed into a muddy, treacherous route filled with deep puddles and slippery patches that made walking both difficult and uncomfortable. Tanzan was an elder monk, advanced in both age and spiritual development, known for his practical wisdom and natural ease with whatever circumstances he encountered. His companion, Ekido, was younger and still working to understand the finer points of monastic discipline and Buddhist practice. Ekido took great pride in following the rules precisely and was particularly concerned with maintaining the strict behavioral codes that governed interactions between monks and lay people. As they rounded a bend in the muddy road, they came upon a beautiful young woman dressed in an elegant silk kimono. She stood at the edge of a particularly large and deep puddle, clearly unable to cross without ruining her expensive clothing and delicate footwear. The woman looked distressed and uncertain, glancing back and forth between the muddy water and the path she needed to follow. Buddhist monastic rules strictly prohibited monks from having physical contact with women, especially young and attractive ones. This prohibition was designed to help monks maintain their vows of celibacy and avoid situations that might lead to temptation or scandal. Aikido was well aware of these rules and expected that he and his companion would need to find a way around the woman or wait for her to solve her problem independently. But without a moment's hesitation, the elder monk Tanzan approached the woman with a gentle smile. Recognizing her predicament and moved by natural compassion, he spoke to her kindly. "Please allow me to help you across this difficult passage," he said with respectful courtesy. Before Aikido could object or even fully process what was happening, Tanzan had carefully lifted the woman in his arms and carried her across the muddy intersection, setting her down gently on the dry ground on the other side. He bowed politely to her, and she thanked him graciously before continuing on her way. The two monks then resumed their own journey, walking side by side as they had before. But now, there was a tension in the air that hadn't existed earlier. Aikido was deeply troubled by what he had witnessed, but he maintained silence out of respect for his elder companion's seniority and reputation for wisdom. As they walked, Aikido's mind raced with confused thoughts and judgments. How could such an advanced practitioner so blatantly violate one of the fundamental rules of monastic conduct? What if other people had seen this inappropriate contact? How could he reconcile his respect for Tanzan with this apparent breach of Buddhist discipline? The monks continued their journey for several hours, covering many miles of terrain as they made their way toward their destination. Throughout this time, Aikido's agitation continued to build. He found himself unable to focus on the natural beauty around them or engage in the mindful walking that was normally an integral part of their travels. As the sun began to set and they neared the monastery where they planned to spend the night, Aikido could no longer contain his confusion and distress. The question that had been burning in his mind all afternoon finally burst forth. "We monks are not supposed to go near women," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, "especially young and lovely ones like the one we encountered today. It is dangerous and against our rules. Why did you do that? How could you carry her when you know it violates our monastic principles?" Tanzan looked at his agitated companion with patient understanding, recognizing the mental suffering that his younger brother had been carrying throughout their journey. His response was simple and direct. "I left the woman there at the roadside," he said gently. "Are you still carrying her?" Buddha's wisdom reminds us, you will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger. Here we discover a teaching about the mental burdens we create and carry long after the original situation has passed. This tale unveils a profound truth about the difference between responding to immediate circumstances with compassion and creating ongoing mental suffering through judgment and rumination. Tanzan's action was motivated by simple kindness. He saw someone in need and responded naturally without attachment to rigid rules or concern about appearances. Aikido's response, while understandable from the perspective of monastic discipline, created hours of mental agitation and suffering. He transformed a brief moment of helpful action into an extended internal drama about rules, propriety, and spiritual correctness. In trying to protect the purity of their practice, He contaminated his own mind with judgment and anxiety. Why do we find it so difficult to let go of experiences that have already ended? The mind has a tendency to replay events, especially those that trigger our sense of right and wrong, proper and improper, acceptable and unacceptable. We carry these mental recordings around like heavy luggage, reviewing them repeatedly and adding layers of analysis, judgment, and emotional reaction. Tanzen's question, "Are you still carrying her?" points directly to this habit of mental carrying. The physical act of helping the woman lasted only a few moments, but Ekido had been mentally carrying both the woman and his judgments about the encounter for hours. The original situation was long over, but his mind kept it alive through constant mental repetition. This pattern appears constantly in our daily lives. Someone says something that offends us in the morning, and we replay the conversation throughout the day, carrying the irritation and resentment long after the words have been spoken. A mistake we made years ago continues to create shame and self-criticism in the present moment. A worry about tomorrow's meeting prevents us from being present to today's experiences. Consider how much of your mental energy goes toward carrying situations that have already ended or haven't yet occurred. The argument with your partner last week that you're still processing internally. The presentation next month that you're already rehearsing and worrying about. The criticism you received from a supervisor that continues to replay in your mind days later. In each case, we're like Aikido, carrying something that exists primarily in our thoughts rather than in present reality. The original situation may have been significant and worthy of attention, but our continued mental carrying often creates more suffering than the original event itself. Zen Buddhism distinguishes between appropriate response and excessive mental elaboration. Tanzan responded to what was actually happening in the moment, a person needing help crossing muddy water. He acted with natural compassion, then let the situation go completely. Aikido created an ongoing internal narrative about what had happened, carrying mental burdens that served no useful purpose. This doesn't mean we should never reflect on our experiences or consider the implications of our actions. There's a difference between skillful reflection that leads to insight or appropriate planning, and obsessive mental rehearsal that creates suffering without producing useful results. The teaching points toward developing what might be called carrying discernment, the ability to distinguish between thoughts and concerns that deserve our attention and those that we can safely put down. Some mental carrying is necessary and beneficial. Most of it is optional and burdensome. Tanzen's approach represents the possibility of living with what Zen calls no mind, responding naturally to each situation without creating elaborate mental stories about our responses. He helped the woman because helping was appropriate in that moment, then released the entire experience without self-consciousness or concern about appearances. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." Tanzan's action was motivated by love, compassion for someone in need. Aikido's mental carrying was motivated by hatred, judgment about rule-breaking and impropriety. The love created a moment of assistance, then disappeared. The hatred created hours of internal suffering. What's particularly beautiful about this exchange is how Tanzan's final question served as both teaching and liberation for his younger companion. In pointing out that Ekido was still carrying the woman mentally, he offered him the opportunity to put her down immediately and return to present moment awareness. Sometimes we discover that we've been carrying mental burdens for so long that we've forgotten they're optional. We've become like people walking around with heavy backpacks, completely forgetting that we could simply take them off and set them down. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, notice what you might be carrying mentally from today's experiences or tomorrow's anticipated challenges. Can you practice Tanzan's approach of responding appropriately to each situation as it arises, then releasing it completely? As the Buddha taught, the secret of health for both mind and body is not to mourn for the past, worry about the future, or anticipate troubles, but to live in the present moment wisely and earnestly. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is learning the difference between appropriate responsiveness and unnecessary mental carrying, discovering the relief that comes from setting down burdens we never needed to pick up in the first place. Now, let us explore a Zen story about the futility of trying to escape aspects of ourselves. This is the man who ran from his shadow. There once lived a man who had developed an intense fear of his own shadow and a deep hatred for his footprints. Every morning when he woke and saw his shadow following him wherever he went, he felt a wave of revulsion and anxiety. The dark silhouette seemed to mock him, mimicking his every movement and gesture. When he walked across sandy ground or dusty paths, he would look back and see the trail of footprints he had left behind. And these too filled him with disgust and shame. These things torment me, he thought to himself one day, as he watched his shadow dance on the wall. My shadow follows me everywhere, reminding me of my presence in this world, and my footprints leave evidence of everywhere I've been. I must find a way to escape from them completely. So he devised what seemed like a logical plan. He would run away from his shadow and outpace his footprints. If he could just move fast enough, surely he could leave these troublesome companions behind. Early one morning, he began to run, determined to free himself from their persistent presence. But as he ran, something frustrating happened. Every time he put his foot down, another footprint appeared in the dirt behind him. His shadow had no trouble at all keeping up with him, moving effortlessly alongside him no matter how fast he moved. The faster he ran, the more footprints he created, and his shadow seemed to grow more animated with each stride. "I'm not running fast enough," he concluded, breathing hard but unwilling to give up. "If I can just increase my speed, I'll surely outdistance them." So he ran faster and faster, his heart pounding and his breath coming in gasps. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed his body to its limits, but still his shadow kept perfect pace with him, and still each step created another footprint in his wake. His frustration grew into desperation as he realized his plan wasn't working. Hour after hour, he continued this frantic chase, running faster and faster, never stopping for a moment's rest. His body began to ache, his lungs burned, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. But he was so fixated on escaping his shadow and footprints that he couldn't see the simple futility of his efforts. Finally, after running for what felt like an eternity, he collapsed from complete exhaustion and died there on the path, his shadow still beside him and his footprints trailing behind him all the way back to where his desperate journey had begun. What the man never understood was that the solution to his problem was remarkably simple. If he had merely stepped into the shade of a tree, his shadow would have vanished completely. And if he had simply sat down and remained still, there would have been no more footprints. As the Buddha observed, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. This ancient wisdom reveals a profound truth about our relationship to the aspects of ourselves we try to escape or eliminate. The deeper teaching here shows us how much energy we waste trying to run away from fundamental aspects of our existence, rather than learning to work skillfully with them. The shadow in this story represents all the parts of ourselves we find unacceptable: our anger, our sadness, our fears, our perceived flaws, or our past mistakes. The footprints represent the evidence of our impact on the world, the traces we leave behind that we sometimes wish we could erase. This pattern of running from ourselves manifests in countless ways throughout our lives. We might try to escape our tendency toward anxiety by staying constantly busy, only to create more stress and more anxiety. We might attempt to outrun our loneliness by filling every moment with social activity, never giving ourselves the stillness necessary to address the root of our isolation. Why do we believe we can solve internal problems through external action? The mind convinces us that if we can just change our circumstances, alter our environment, or modify our behavior sufficiently, we can escape the uncomfortable aspects of our psyche. But as the running man discovered, this approach often intensifies the very problems we're trying to solve. Think about the shadows you might be running from in your own life. Perhaps you're trying to escape feelings of inadequacy by working excessive hours, creating more exhaustion and less time for the self-care that might actually address your insecurity. Maybe you're attempting to avoid grief after a loss by staying constantly entertained, preventing yourself from processing the emotions that need to be felt for healing to occur. The footprints we try to escape might be past mistakes, relationships that ended badly, or choices we regret. We exhaust ourselves trying to outrun the consequences of our history rather than learning to make peace with our imperfect human journey. Zen Buddhism points toward a radically different approach. Instead of running from our shadows, we can learn to step into the shade. Instead of trying to eliminate our footprints, we can learn to walk more mindfully. The very things we're trying to escape often contain the seeds of our liberation when we stop fleeing and start facing them with compassion. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox captures the essence of working skillfully with our shadows. We can accept ourselves completely while still engaging in growth and healing, but from a place of self-compassion rather than self-rejection. The shade of the tree in the story represents the sanctuary we find when we stop running and start practicing self-acceptance. When we turn toward our difficult emotions with kindness rather than resistance, they often dissolve naturally, like shadows disappearing in the shade. When we cease the frantic activity designed to prove our worth or escape our discomfort, we create space for genuine rest and insight. The Buddha said, "The way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart." The path to freedom from our shadows leads through them, not around them. By bringing compassionate attention to the parts of ourselves we've been running from, we transform our relationship to them completely. Consider what might change if you stopped running from your particular shadows tomorrow? What if you approached your anxiety with curiosity rather than resistance? What if you met your sadness with compassion rather than distraction? What if you examined your mistakes with learning rather than shame? Tonight, as you prepare for rest, notice if there are any aspects of yourself you've been trying to outrun. Can you imagine stepping into the shade of self-acceptance, even briefly? What would it feel like to sit still long enough that no new footprints of regret or shame get created? As the Buddha taught, the trouble is you think you have time, but actually, the time to stop running and find peace with yourself is always right now. Let us now turn to a tale about the difference between intellectual knowledge and lived wisdom. This is Tokusan's rice cakes. Tokusan was renowned throughout the land as a brilliant scholar of the Diamond Sutra, one of the most profound and complex texts in all of Buddhism. He had spent decades studying its every line, memorizing its intricate philosophical arguments, and writing extensive commentaries that other scholars praised for their depth and sophistication. His understanding of the sutra's teachings about emptiness, non-attachment, and the illusory nature of phenomena was considered masterful by academic standards. When Tokusan heard that Zen masters in the southern regions were teaching a different approach to Buddhism, one that emphasized direct experience over scholarly study, he was both intrigued and skeptical. These teachers claimed that enlightenment could be achieved through simple meditation and direct pointing to the mind's true nature, rather than through years of textual analysis and philosophical debate. Convinced that these southern teachers were misguided and that they were leading people away from the Buddha's true teachings, Tokusan decided to journey south to challenge them in formal debate. He was confident that his superior knowledge of the scriptures would easily expose their shallow understanding and return them to proper Buddhist study. He packed his extensive collection of commentaries and scholarly works into a large traveling case and set out on the long journey. The weight of his books slowed his progress, but he was determined to bring these important texts with him as ammunition for the intellectual battles ahead. After several days of travel, Tokusan grew hungry and stopped at a small roadside tea stall run by an elderly woman who was selling rice cakes and simple refreshments to passing travelers. The modest stall offered welcome shade from the midday sun, and the aroma of freshly prepared food reminded him how long it had been since his last meal. "Venerable scholar," the old woman said respectfully, "I would like to purchase some rice cakes to refresh myself," Tokusan announced, setting down his heavy pack of books. The old woman looked at him curiously, noting his scholarly robes and the obvious weight of the leather case he carried. "What is it that you carry in that large pack?" she asked with genuine interest. "These are my commentaries on the Diamond Sutra," Tokusan replied with considerable pride, patting the case affectionately. "I have devoted my life to understanding this most profound of all Buddhist texts." "Is that so?" the old woman said thoughtfully. "How wonderful. Then perhaps you can help me understand something that has always puzzled me about that text." Tokusan straightened up, pleased to have an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. "I would be honored to answer any question you might have about the Diamond Sutra." The old woman smiled gently. "If you can answer my question correctly, I will give you the rice cakes for free. If you cannot provide a satisfactory answer, I'm afraid you'll need to find refreshment elsewhere." Tokusan, completely confident in his scholarly mastery, readily agreed to this arrangement. What question could a simple tea stall operator possibly pose that would challenge his decades of study? The old woman then quoted directly from the sutra that Tokusan had spent his life analyzing. The Diamond Sutra teaches us that the mind of the past cannot be held, the mind of the present cannot be held, and the mind of the future cannot be held. If this teaching is true, venerable scholar, which mind do you intend to refresh with my rice cakes? Tokusan was struck speechless. All his years of sophisticated analysis, all his elaborate theoretical frameworks, all his profound commentaries suddenly seemed utterly useless in the face of this simple, direct question. He stood there in stunned silence, unable to produce any answer at all. The old woman waited patiently, but it became clear that the great scholar had no response to offer. With gentle compassion, she explained that he would need to continue his journey without refreshment from her stall. Humbled and confused, Tokusan gathered his books and continued walking, but his confidence was completely shattered. He realized that his intellectual understanding was a world away from the direct, lived wisdom that this simple woman possessed. His scholarly knowledge had prepared him to discuss Buddhist philosophy, but not to embody its essential truth. As the Buddha understood, the finger that points to the moon is not the moon. What emerges from this story is the crucial distinction between conceptual understanding and direct realization, between knowing about truth and being truth. This tale unveils a pattern that extends far beyond Buddhist scholarship into every area of human learning and development. We often confuse our ability to explain something intellectually with actually understanding it in a way that transforms how we live. We become experts in describing love while remaining unable to love skillfully, or authorities on happiness while living in constant anxiety. Tokusan's predicament reveals how the accumulation of knowledge can sometimes become an obstacle to genuine insight. His years of study had given him tremendous confidence in his understanding, but they had also created a barrier between him and direct experience. He knew what the Diamond Sutra said about the nature of mind, but he had never really looked at his own mind with the kind of immediate attention the text was pointing toward. Why do we so often mistake intellectual knowledge for wisdom? The thinking mind is seductive in its ability to create elaborate explanations and sophisticated frameworks. It gives us a sense of mastery and control, making us feel that we understand complex realities simply because we can discuss them fluently. But as Tokusan discovered, when life presents us with a direct challenge, conceptual knowledge often proves inadequate. The old woman's question was devastating in its simplicity. She wasn't asking for a philosophical discourse about the nature of time or consciousness. She was pointing directly to the immediate reality of Tokusan's experience. If there truly is no past, present, or future mind to be grasped, what exactly was seeking refreshment in that moment? This teaching appears constantly in modern life. We might read countless books about mindfulness, but still find ourselves lost in anxious thoughts during stressful situations. We could study relationship psychology extensively while remaining unable to listen deeply to our partner during conflict. We might understand the theory of non-attachment intellectually while still becoming upset when our plans don't unfold as expected. Zen Master Dogen taught, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. True spiritual study leads us toward direct investigation of our immediate experience rather than accumulation of concepts about that experience. The rice cakes in the story represent the simple nourishment that comes from direct engagement with reality rather than abstract theorizing about it. When we're truly hungry, whether for food, understanding, or spiritual fulfillment, what feeds us is immediate presence, not clever explanations of presence. In meditation practice, we often encounter this same distinction. We can know a great deal about meditation techniques while having very little direct experience of the awareness those techniques are designed to reveal. The concepts point towards something that must be discovered through immediate investigation, not through more thinking about the concepts. The Buddha said, "However many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do you if you do not act upon them?" The old woman was inviting Tokusan to act upon the Diamond Sutra's teachings by applying them to his immediate situation, rather than carrying them around as intellectual possessions. Tonight, as you reflect on the knowledge and understanding you've accumulated, can you distinguish between what you know about and what you actually know? Is there some area of your life where intellectual understanding might be creating the illusion of wisdom while preventing genuine transformation? As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the most profound teachings are the ones that leave us speechless, pointing us back towards the immediacy of our actual experience. Let us continue with a story about the rarity and power of genuine recognition. This is a smile in his lifetime. Master Mokugan was renowned throughout the region as one of the most accomplished and respected Zen teachers of his generation. His understanding of the Dharma was considered profound, his meditation skills were exceptional, and his ability to guide students toward awakening was widely recognized by other masters. Yet despite his spiritual achievements and the deep reverence in which he was held, Mokugan was known for one particular characteristic that both impressed and intimidated his students: his consistently stern and serious demeanor. In all his years of teaching, through countless Dharma talks, meditation sessions, and private meetings with students, Master Mokugan had never been seen to smile. His face maintained a grave, composed expression that reflected the weight and responsibility he felt in transmitting the Buddha's teachings. His students held him in tremendous awe, recognizing his wisdom and dedication, but they also felt a certain fear in his presence due to his unrelenting seriousness. Among his many disciples was one particularly devoted student who had been studying under Mokugen for several years. This student approached his practice with intense dedication, rising before dawn each day, sitting in meditation for hours, studying the classical texts with great care, and throwing himself wholeheartedly into understanding the deepest aspects of Zen philosophy and practice. As he observed his master's perpetually serious expression day after day, year after year, this devoted student made a silent, private vow that became the secret motivation driving his entire spiritual journey. "I will not rest," he promised himself, "until I have seen my master smile. I will practice with such sincerity and achieve such depth of realization that I will somehow earn the gift of seeing joy on his face." This became his hidden goal, the personal quest that gave additional meaning to his already intensive practice. He meditated with extraordinary dedication, not only for his own liberation, but with the hope that his efforts might somehow bring happiness to his revered teacher. He studied with exceptional focus, always wondering if this insight or that breakthrough might be the one that would finally evoke a smile from Master Mokugen. Years passed this way. The student's practice deepened considerably, and his understanding of Zen teachings became quite sophisticated. He learned to sit in meditation for extended periods without discomfort, mastered complex philosophical concepts, and even began to experience profound moments of insight and clarity. Yet through all this development, his master's expression remained unchanged, serious, composed, and completely without any visible sign of joy or satisfaction. The student began to wonder if his master was even capable of smiling, or if perhaps he had set himself an impossible task. But his determination never wavered, and he continued to approach his practice with the same intensity, always hoping that the next realization would be the one that would transform his teacher's stern countenance. Finally, after many years of this dedicated practice, the student achieved a breakthrough that was unmistakably genuine and transformative. He experienced a profound state of realization in which he understood directly the nature of his own mind and the fundamental truths that all his studying and meditation had been pointing toward. The understanding was not merely intellectual, but embodied, a complete knowing that transformed his relationship to existence itself. Filled with joy and gratitude for this life-changing insight, he immediately sought out Master Mokugen to share his experience. He approached his teacher with deep humility, but also with the confidence that comes from authentic realization. "Master," he said, bowing deeply before his teacher, "I am liberated. I have experienced the awakening that all our practice has been preparing me for." As he looked up at his teacher's face to gauge his response, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in anyone's memory, Master Mokugen's stern features transformed completely. A wide, radiant smile spread across his face, as warm and bright as the morning sun breaking through clouds after a long, dark night. "I am so happy for you," Mokugen said, his voice filled with genuine joy and pride for his student's achievement. Later, the student shared his experience with his fellow practitioners, telling them about the remarkable moment when he had finally seen their master smile. "It took me 10 years of the most intensive practice of my life," he said with a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction, "just to make him smile once. But I can honestly say it was worth every moment of effort. That single smile contained more teaching and blessing than 1,000 Dharma talks." As the Buddha observed, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound joy that arises when we witness authentic spiritual breakthrough in another person. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the deep connection between genuine realization and natural joy. Master Mokugen's smile wasn't a reward he chose to give his student, but rather the spontaneous expression of his own happiness at witnessing true awakening. His years of seriousness weren't due to lack of compassion, but reflected the gravity he felt in guiding students towards something precious and transformative. This tale unveils a beautiful truth about the relationship between teacher and student, between one person's growth and another's joy. The student's dedication wasn't motivated primarily by his own liberation, but by his desire to bring happiness to someone he loved and respected. In pursuing his teacher's smile, he found his own freedom. Why did the student's breakthrough finally evoke Mokugen's joy when years of progress had not? The difference between gradual improvement and genuine realization is qualitative rather than quantitative. Technical skill, intellectual understanding, and even deep meditative states, while valuable, are different from the fundamental shift in consciousness that constitutes true awakening. Mokugen could see the difference between his student's increasing sophistication and his actual liberation. Only when authentic realization occurred did the master's natural response emerge, the spontaneous joy that flows when we witness someone discovering their true nature. Consider how this teaching relates to the moments of genuine breakthrough in your own life and in the lives of people you care about. There's a particular quality of recognition that occurs when someone moves from understanding something about truth to embodying truth directly. These moments are rare and precious, worthy of celebration in ways that ordinary achievements are not. This pattern appears in many forms of human development beyond formal spiritual practice. A teacher might work with a struggling student for months, maintaining patience and encouragement through small improvements, only to experience profound joy when the student finally grasps a concept completely. A therapist might support a client through years of gradual healing, but feel special celebration when a fundamental psychological shift occurs. The student's 10-year quest reveals something important about the nature of authentic motivation in spiritual practice. He wasn't practicing primarily for personal gain, but from love. Love for his teacher and desire to bring him joy. This kind of motivation often leads to deeper realization than purely self-centered spiritual seeking. Zen master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." The student began by studying intensively, gradually learned to study himself, and finally achieved the self-forgetting that allowed genuine realization to emerge. Only then did his teacher's smile appear. Master Mokugen's consistent seriousness through the years wasn't coldness or lack of appreciation for his students' efforts. It reflected his understanding that partial realization, while encouraging, isn't the same as liberation. His refusal to smile prematurely was actually a form of compassion, holding space for the genuine breakthrough that eventually occurred. In our own spiritual development, we might sometimes feel discouraged when our progress doesn't seem to evoke the recognition or celebration we hope for from teachers, mentors, or spiritual communities. This story suggests that such recognition may be reserved for moments of authentic transformation rather than incremental improvement. The smile, when it finally came, contained years of accumulated appreciation, love, and joy. It wasn't just a response to the student's final breakthrough, but an expression of all the happiness that had been building through his decade of dedicated practice. Sometimes the most profound gifts are worth waiting for, because they contain the essence of everything that came before. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Master Mokugen's smile was worth more than 1,000 expressions of encouragement, because it emerged from recognition of genuine peace and freedom. This teaching also points toward the joy that naturally arises when we witness authentic spiritual breakthrough in others. When someone we care about experiences genuine healing, insight, or liberation, our happiness often exceeds what we feel for our own achievements. This sympathetic joy reflects our deep interconnectedness and the natural celebration that occurs when consciousness recognizes itself in another. Tonight, as you reflect on your own spiritual journey and the people who have supported your growth, can you sense the profound joy that awaits not just your own realization, but your recognition of awakening in others? As the Buddha taught, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, even so let one cultivate a boundless love towards all beings. Perhaps the most beautiful smiles are those that arise not from personal achievement, but from witnessing the liberation of someone we deeply love. Our next story reveals a teaching about the fluid nature of identity and the wisdom that transcends conventional categories of pure and impure. This is the all-purpose bowl. Master Sengai's living quarters reflected his approach to life: simple, practical, and unencumbered by the elaborate protocols that many people believed necessary for proper spiritual living. Among his few possessions was a single mixing bowl that served multiple functions throughout his daily routine, demonstrating his commitment to simplicity and his freedom from conventional social expectations. Each morning after relieving himself, the master would fill this bowl with water and use it to wash his hands thoroughly, ensuring proper hygiene while maintaining his focus on present moment awareness. The bowl served this practical sanitary function with the same dignity it brought to all its uses. Later, at lunchtime, Master Sengai would take this same bowl to prepare vegetables that would accompany his simple meal of boiled rice. He would wash and cut vegetables in the bowl, mix seasonings, and use it for all the food preparation that his modest meals required. Finally, he would add the prepared rice to the bowl, transforming it into his eating vessel for the day's main meal. This pattern continued day after day, season after season. The same bowl served seamlessly as wash basin, food preparation vessel, and rice container, its functions shifting fluidly according to the master's immediate needs. To him, this arrangement was perfectly natural and efficient, demonstrating the practical wisdom of not multiplying possessions unnecessarily. However, this unconventional approach eventually caught the attention of a guest who was visiting the temple. Watching the master's routine with growing concern, the visitor finally felt compelled to speak up about what seemed like a serious hygiene violation. "Your Reverence," the guest cautioned carefully, not wanting to offend, but feeling the need to point out what appeared obvious. "Are you sure it's all right to use the same bowl to wash your hands and then serve food? Doesn't this seem unsanitary? What about the risk of contamination?" Master Sengai paused in his meal preparation and looked at his concerned visitor with eyes that held no defensiveness, no irritation at having his methods questioned. Instead, his response revealed a perspective that transcended conventional categories of clean and dirty, appropriate and inappropriate. "When I put food into it," the master explained simply, "it's rice bowl world. And when I wash my hands in it, it's wash bowl world." He paused to let this sink in before continuing with the heart of his teaching. "To you, a wash bowl seems filthy. To me, there's neither pure nor polluted." The guest stood quietly, absorbing the implications of this response, recognizing that the master had just revealed something profound about the nature of identity, function, and the mental categories we use to organize our experience of reality. The Buddha taught, All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive diligently. This teaching relates profoundly to our understanding of how identity and purpose are fluid rather than fixed, and how our mental categories often create artificial distinctions that separate us from direct experience. This ancient wisdom illuminates our tendency to assign permanent identities to objects, people, and situations based on single functions or temporary characteristics. We label things as clean or dirty, sacred or profane, appropriate or inappropriate, often forgetting that these designations exist in our minds rather than as inherent properties of the things themselves. Master Sengai's bowl demonstrates something revolutionary about the nature of identity and function. The physical bowl remained unchanged, whether serving as wash basin or food container. Only its contextual use shifted. The master recognized that our mental categories of pure and impure are human constructs that can blind us to the essential nature of things, which exists beyond such dualistic thinking. This teaching reveals our attachment to complex systems of classification and protocol that often serve social convention more than practical wisdom. We create elaborate rules about which objects can serve, which functions, which combinations are acceptable, which boundaries must never be crossed. While some distinctions serve genuine health and safety purposes, many others simply reflect conditioned thinking rather than necessary reality. Why do we find it so disturbing when someone violates our expected categories and boundaries? This discomfort often arises from our deep need for predictability and our investment in the mental frameworks we use to organize experience. When someone demonstrates that our categories are more flexible than we assumed, it can threaten our sense of how the world should work. The master's phrase, rice bowl world and wash bowl world, points toward understanding how context determines meaning rather than inherent properties determining function. The same water can be drinking water in one context and cleaning water in another. The same words can be poetry in one setting and prose in another. The same action can be sacred in one moment and ordinary in another. This story also reveals the difference between practical hygiene and psychological categorization. Master Sengai wasn't advocating careless sanitation. He washed both the bowl and his hands thoroughly. His point was that our mental designations of pure and impure often extend far beyond actual cleanliness into realm of social anxiety and rigid thinking that can separate us from direct, practical engagement with life. We can observe similar patterns in many areas where we create unnecessary complications through over-categorization. The person who needs multiple sets of dishes because they can't bear to serve different types of food on the same plates. The office that requires separate equipment for different tasks that could easily be shared. The community that insists on elaborate protocols for activities that could be handled simply and directly. Zen practice cultivates what might be called functional flexibility, the ability to work with things according to their immediate utility rather than their assigned social categories. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine practical considerations, but rather questioning which distinctions serve real purposes and which ones simply reflect conditioned thinking. Additionally, our minds tend to assume that spiritual people should maintain higher standards of purity and separation than ordinary folks. Master Sengai's approach suggests that true spiritual understanding might actually move in the opposite direction, toward greater integration and less artificial separation between different aspects of life. The story points us toward understanding that purity and pollution are often mental constructs rather than absolute realities. When we can see beyond these constructed categories to the essential nature of things, including our own essential nature, we discover a freedom that doesn't depend on maintaining elaborate systems of separation and classification. We also find ourselves confronted by questions about what constitutes appropriate spiritual behavior. The master's unconventional approach challenged his guests' assumptions about proper conduct, revealing how our expectations about spiritual living can sometimes create unnecessary complexity rather than supporting genuine simplicity and wisdom. Tonight, as you notice the various categories and distinctions you use to organize your experience, can you identify places where these mental constructs might be creating unnecessary separation or complication? What would it mean to hold your classifications more lightly, allowing function and context to determine appropriateness rather than rigid preconceptions? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. When we understand that the categories we assign to experiences exist in our minds rather than as inherent properties of things themselves, we discover a flexibility and freedom that allows us to work with life more directly and practically, seeing through artificial distinctions to the fluid, interconnected nature of all existence. Now, let us explore a story about the weight of our thoughts. This is the stone mind. Master Hogan was walking peacefully through the monastery garden with one of his most earnest students on a warm afternoon. The garden was a place of contemplation, carefully designed with winding paths that led past ancient trees, small ponds, and carefully arranged rocks that had been placed by previous generations of monks to inspire reflection and meditation. As they strolled along one of the main pathways, the student's attention was drawn to a particularly large boulder that sat prominently near the center of the garden. This stone was massive, perhaps the size of a small building, and had been there for so many years that moss had grown across its surface, and small plants had taken root in its crevices. It was clearly a permanent and substantial feature of the monastery grounds. The student had been studying Buddhist philosophy intensively and was eager to demonstrate his understanding of the teachings he had been learning. He saw in this prominent stone an opportunity to engage his master in a philosophical discussion that would reveal his grasp of complex metaphysical concepts. Pointing directly at the large rock, the student posed what he believed was a sophisticated question that would invite profound dialogue about the nature of reality and consciousness. "Master," the student said, with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about abstract spiritual matters, "the sutras teach us that all phenomena ultimately exist within consciousness, that everything we perceive is, in the deepest sense, a manifestation of mind itself. Given this fundamental teaching about the nature of reality, would you say that this large stone is inside my mind? Or would you say it exists outside of my mind as a separate object?" The student stood there expectantly, clearly proud of his question and anticipating a lengthy philosophical discourse about the relationship between consciousness and material reality. He had framed his inquiry in terms of classical Buddhist metaphysics, touching on some of the most sophisticated concepts in the tradition regarding the nature of perception and the ultimate ground of existence. Master Hogan paused for a moment, looking at his student with the calm, penetrating gaze that characterized his teaching style. He considered the question carefully, not dismissing it, but recognizing immediately the mental trap his student had created for himself through excessive intellectualization. Rather than launching into the kind of abstract philosophical explanation the student was expecting, Master Hogan responded with perfect simplicity and directness. "You must have a very heavy mind," he replied gently, "to be carrying a stone like that around in it." The student stood there speechless, his elaborate philosophical framework suddenly revealed as unnecessarily complex. In a single sentence, his master had pointed directly to the absurdity of his mental construction, while simultaneously teaching him something profound about the nature of thought itself. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. What emerges from this story is a teaching about how our thinking mind can create burdens that have no basis in actual reality. The deeper lesson here illuminates how intellectual analysis, while valuable in appropriate contexts, can become a form of mental carrying that weighs us down unnecessarily. The student had taken a simple, direct experience, encountering a stone in a garden, and transformed it into a philosophical problem that required mental effort to resolve. Hogan's response reveals the absurdity of this entire mental process. The stone wasn't actually in the student's mind in any literal sense, nor did the student need to figure out its ontological status to encounter it appropriately. By pointing to the heaviness of carrying such concepts around mentally, the master highlighted how much unnecessary labor we create for ourselves through excessive thinking. Why do we tend to complicate direct experience with elaborate mental frameworks? The thinking mind offers us a sense of understanding and control. When we can categorize, analyze, and explain our experiences, we feel that we are gaining mastery over reality. But as this story reveals, sometimes our explanations become more burdensome than the original experiences they were meant to clarify. This pattern appears constantly in our daily lives. We might encounter a simple emotion like sadness and immediately begin analyzing its causes, constructing narratives about what it means, and developing strategies for managing it. What began as a straightforward feeling becomes a heavy psychological project that we carry around in our minds. Or we might have a disagreement with a friend and transform it into an elaborate mental case study involving personality analysis, relationship dynamics, and complex theories about human behavior. The simple task of addressing a misunderstanding becomes weighed down with conceptual baggage that makes resolution more difficult rather than easier. In spiritual practice, this tendency toward mental heaviness shows up as what might be called dharma collecting, accumulating insights, techniques, and understandings that become burdens rather than liberations. We might study meditation for years while creating an increasingly complex internal library of spiritual concepts that we carry around rather than simply sitting quietly and breathing. Zen master Yun Men said, "Every day is a good day." This points toward the possibility of meeting each moment directly without the mental weight of excessive interpretation or analysis. The stone in the garden was simply a stone, an object to be appreciated, perhaps sat upon or simply noticed and passed by. It didn't require philosophical categorization to be encountered appropriately. Hogan's teaching method was particularly skillful because he didn't dismiss his students' question as wrong or inappropriate. Instead, He pointed to the practical consequence of thinking in such abstract terms, the heaviness it creates in our mental experience. By using the metaphor of carrying physical weight, he made the burden of excessive thinking tangible and obvious. This teaching doesn't advocate for abandoning all thinking or philosophical inquiry. Intellectual understanding has its place and value, but it does point toward distinguishing between useful thinking that serves practical purposes and mental elaboration that creates unnecessary complexity and burden. Sometimes, the most profound spiritual insight is recognizing that we don't need to understand everything intellectually. We can encounter a beautiful sunset without analyzing the physics of light refraction. We can feel love for someone without constructing elaborate theories about the nature of human connection. We can sit in meditation without carrying around complex ideas about enlightenment. The Buddha taught simplicity, patience, compassion. These three are your greatest treasures. Hogan was pointing his student toward the treasure of simplicity, the relief that comes from setting down mental weights we never needed to pick up in the first place. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, notice if you're carrying any stones around in your mind. Complex worries about future scenarios, elaborate interpretations of past events, or sophisticated analyses of your current circumstances. What would it feel like to simply set these mental burdens down, even temporarily? As the Buddha reminded us, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Sometimes the deepest peace comes not from finding better thoughts to think, but from recognizing that we don't need to carry so many thoughts at all. Our next story reveals a profound lesson about the nature of anger and our projections onto others. This is The Empty Boat. A young boatman known for his fiery temper was ferrying his small wooden craft across a wide, misty river in the early morning hours. He took great pride in his navigational skills and the care he brought to his work. But the slightest inconvenience or disruption could send him into a blazing rage. His reputation for explosive anger was well known among the other river workers, who often avoided him during his darker moods. On this particular morning, thick fog had settled over the water, reducing visibility to just a few feet in any direction. The boatman squinted through the grey mist, carefully steering his vessel across the familiar waters. Suddenly, through the swirling fog, he saw another boat moving directly toward him on a collision course. "Hey, turn aside!" he shouted into the mist, his voice echoing across the water. "You're going to hit me! Can't you see where you're going?" But the other boat continued steadily forward, showing no sign of changing direction. The boatman's anger began to build as he shouted again, his voice now filled with fury. He cursed the other pilot's carelessness and incompetence, his rage growing with each passing second. Despite his increasingly angry warnings, the other boat struck his own with a solid, jarring thud. Now boiling with indignation, the boatman was ready to leap into the other vessel and give its foolish pilot a piece of his mind. He prepared himself for a confrontation, ready to unleash all his pent-up frustration on the person who had so carelessly disrupted his morning journey. His fists were clenched, his face red with anger as he moved toward the other boat. But as he peered through the mist at the vessel that had struck him, he discovered something that stopped him completely. The boat was empty. There was no pilot at the tiller, no person to blame or confront. It was simply a drifting boat that had been carried into his path by the river's current. In that instant, his anger vanished completely. It was impossible to be furious at an empty boat, There was no target for his rage, no one to receive his harsh words. All the aggressive energy that had built up inside him suddenly had nowhere to go. He simply pushed the empty vessel away and continued his journey, his mind now as calm as the misty river around him. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The heart of this lesson lies in recognizing how much of our anger is directed at empty boats, projections of intention where none exists. This tale unveils a fundamental truth about the nature of human reactivity. Most of our emotional suffering comes not from what others actually do to us, but from the stories we create about their motivations, intentions, and character. We assume malice where there might be distraction, disrespect where there might be ignorance, and personal attack where there might be simple circumstance. Why do we so readily populate empty boats with imaginary pilots to blame? Our minds evolved to quickly assess threats and assign agency to potentially dangerous situations. This survival mechanism served our ancestors well when distinguishing between a rustling bush caused by wind versus a predator. But in modern social situations, this same tendency leads us to attribute deliberate, harmful intent to actions that may have no such motivation. Think about your daily interactions. When someone cuts you off in traffic, do you immediately assume they're inconsiderate and selfish? When a colleague doesn't return your greeting, do you decide they're being rude or dismissive? When a friend cancels plans last minute, do you interpret it as a sign they don't value your friendship? In each case, you may be creating a pilot for an empty boat. The driver who cut you off might be rushing to the hospital with a sick child. Your colleague might be preoccupied with devastating personal news. Your friend might be struggling with anxiety or depression. Most people's actions have far more to do with their internal experience than with any intention to harm you. Zen master Huang Po taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." When we react to our interpretations rather than to what actually happened, we're fighting empty boats. This doesn't mean becoming passive or failing to set appropriate boundaries. If someone's behavior affects you negatively, you can address it skillfully without creating elaborate stories about their motivations. You can say, "When you interrupted me, I felt unheard," rather than, "You're always so disrespectful and self-centered." The practice involves pausing when anger arises and asking, "Am I reacting to what actually happened, or to the story I'm telling myself about what happened? Am I angry at a person's actions, or at the pilot I've imagined in their empty boat?" In Zen meditation, we learn to observe our thoughts and emotions as passing phenomena rather than absolute truths. When anger arises, instead of immediately believing and acting on it, we can notice, anger is here. What story is my mind creating? What am I assuming about this person's intentions? The Buddha said, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." Each time we populate an empty boat with a malicious pilot, we create suffering for ourselves. Each time we remember that most boats are simply drifting with the current, we free ourselves from unnecessary reactivity. Tonight, as you reflect on recent moments of frustration or anger, can you identify which boats were truly piloted and which were empty? Can you feel the difference in your body between reacting to harmful intent versus responding to simple circumstance? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. When we stop fighting empty boats, we discover that peace was available all along. Our next story reveals how liberation comes not from achieving something new, but from recognizing what was never born and can never die. This is the teaching of freedom from birth and death. In a quiet monastery garden where cherry blossoms drifted on the spring breeze, a dedicated student named Goshu approached the wise Zen master Yue. For years, Goshu had been practicing meditation, studying texts, and following all the prescribed methods of spiritual development. Yet despite his sincere efforts, he felt no closer to the enlightenment he desperately sought. Goshu bowed respectfully before his teacher, his face showing the strain of prolonged spiritual seeking. Master, I have been studying Zen for many years, following every instruction, sitting in meditation daily, reading the ancient texts, but I have not yet succeeded. I feel as lost as when I began. Please give me some guidance. What am I missing? What more must I do? Yue looked at his earnest student with compassion, seeing the weight of spiritual ambition that had become a burden rather than a path to freedom. He understood that Goshu's very effort to achieve enlightenment had become the obstacle to recognizing his inherent awakeness. There is no secret trick to Zen study, Yue said simply. It's just a matter of freedom from birth and death. Goshu's brow furrowed with confusion. This answer seemed to make his quest even more daunting. Master, how does one pass through birth and death to freedom? That sounds like the most difficult task of all. If I cannot even quiet my mind for a few minutes, how can I transcend birth and death? Yui's eyes brightened, and he raised his voice with sudden intensity. Your every passing thought is birth and death. At these words, something shifted dramatically in Goshu's understanding. Like a veil suddenly lifted, he saw that what he had been seeking as some future attainment was actually the very nature of his present experience. The constant arising and passing away of thoughts, sensations, and emotions. This endless flow was not something to escape, but the very freedom he had been pursuing. Goshu went into ecstasy, feeling as if he had put down a heavy burden he didn't even realize he had been carrying. The relief was profound and immediate. All his years of struggling to become something special dissolved into the recognition that he had never been anything other than the aware space in which all experience appears and disappears. As the Buddha observed, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. What emerges from this story is the recognition that we suffer not because we lack something, but because we don't recognize the freedom that is our fundamental nature. Why do we carry the heavy burden of spiritual becoming? Zen Buddhism points to our identification with the content of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. We mistake ourselves for the stream of thoughts, emotions, and sensations instead of recognizing ourselves as the aware space in which this stream flows. Every thought that arises is born. Every thought that fades away dies. Every emotion emerges from nowhere and dissolves back into nowhere. Every sensation appears and disappears. This constant birth and death happening in awareness is not a problem to solve, but the very movement of life itself. The deeper understanding here reveals that what we call birth and death are simply names we give to the natural flowing of experience. When we identify with the flow, we suffer the anxiety of constant change. When we recognize ourselves as the awareness in which the flow appears, we discover unshakable peace. Zen Master Huangpo taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." This points to the extraordinary fact that the enlightenment we seek is not hidden in special states, but in the ordinary awareness that knows every state. The same awareness that knows anxiety also knows peace. The same awareness that knows confusion also knows clarity. The Buddha said, "In the sky, there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. Our spiritual seeking often creates the very problem it attempts to solve by imagining that some states of consciousness are spiritual while others are mundane. Consider how much energy you invest in trying to have better thoughts, more peaceful emotions, or more pleasant experiences. Each effort to improve the content of consciousness reinforces the belief that you are that content, rather than the awareness that witnesses it all with equal presence. In Japanese Zen, there is a teaching called just sitting, or shikantaza. This practice involves recognizing that the sitting itself is enlightenment, rather than a method to achieve enlightenment. Similarly, your current awareness, exactly as it is the freedom you seek, rather than a stepping stone to freedom. Tonight, as thoughts arise and pass away in your awareness, can you recognize the birth and death that UEA pointed to? Can you see that you are not the thoughts that come and go, but the unchanging awareness in which they appear? As the Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. The salvation is not in perfecting the conditioned, but in recognizing the unconditioned awareness that you already are. Let us now turn to a story about authentic communication and the difference between social rituals and genuine inquiry. This is the teaching of the Zen master in the fields and the students' dance. In the early morning hours, when mist still clings to the rice paddies and the air carries the fresh coolness that will soon give way to the day's heat, a Zen master works quietly in the monastery's fields. His movements are unhurried and precise as he tends to the young plants, pulling weeds and adjusting the small channels that direct water through the terraced plots. This manual labor is as much a part of his spiritual practice as formal meditation, each action performed with complete attention and care. Along the path that borders these fields, students begin their daily procession toward the meditation hall for morning sitting practice. They walk in contemplative silence, their minds already turning inward in preparation for the period of formal meditation that will begin their day. The sight of their master working in the fields has become familiar, a reminder that spiritual practice extends far beyond the cushion into every aspect of daily life. As each student passes by the working master, he looks up from his tasks and calls out the same friendly greeting. "Good morning, how are you?" His voice carries genuine warmth and interest, as if he has been waiting specifically for the opportunity to connect with this particular person in this particular moment. Student after student responds with cheerful but automatic replies. "Good, thank you, master," or "Very well," or "Fine, fine." Their answers come quickly and easily, requiring no thought or self-examination. These are the responses that social convention provides for such moments: pleasant, positive, and designed to keep conversation moving smoothly without creating awkwardness or delay. With each conventional answer, the Zen master sighs quietly and shakes his head with what appears to be disappointment. Yet he continues his pattern, greeting the next passing student with the same question, receiving the same type of response and expressing the same subtle frustration with the exchange. Finally, one student approaches whose awareness has been sharpened by observing this repeated pattern. When the master calls out his familiar greeting, "Good morning, how are you?" this student pauses instead of offering an immediate reply. He considers the question seriously, as if hearing it for the first time. After a moment of genuine reflection, instead of answering with words, the student removes his hat, turns it around so it sits backward on his head, and performs a small, spontaneous dance, a few steps that express something authentic about his actual state of being in this moment. His response is playful, original, and completely his own. The Zen master's face breaks into a broad smile. "Now that is much better," he exclaims, with obvious delight. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, speak only endearing speech, speech that is welcomed, speech, when it brings no evil to others, is pleasant. This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between communication that connects and conversation that merely fills space. Why do we default to automatic responses when asked about our well-being, even by people who might genuinely want to know? Buddhist psychology reveals that most social interactions operate through learned scripts that prioritize efficiency over authenticity. We develop standard replies that require no vulnerability, self-examination, or real presence in order to navigate social expectations quickly and safely. The master's repeated sighs express the spiritual teacher's recognition that these conversational habits reflect deeper patterns of unconscious living. When we answer, "How are you?" without actually checking in with ourselves, we miss opportunities for both self-awareness and genuine connection. We remain strangers to our own experience while presenting pleasant facades to others. The student's creative response demonstrates what Zen calls original mind, consciousness that responds freshly to each situation rather than relying on conditioned patterns. His little dance wasn't elaborate or dramatically expressive, but it emerged from actual awareness of his state in that moment, rather than from social programming. This story addresses the broader question of authenticity in daily communication. How often do we ask questions we don't really want answered? How frequently do we give responses that reveal nothing about our actual experience? These habits create a kind of collective sleepwalking, where everyone participates in conversations that never quite make contact. The Buddha taught about right speech as one of the essential elements of spiritual development. This includes not only avoiding harmful words, but also cultivating communication that serves truth and connection. Right speech emerges naturally when we bring genuine presence to our interactions, rather than operating on autopilot. Consider how your own conversations might change if you treated "How are you?" as a real inquiry requiring honest response. This doesn't mean burdening others with elaborate personal details, but it might mean pausing to actually check your state before answering, allowing something authentic to emerge, rather than defaulting to "fine." The master's work in the fields, while conducting these social experiments, reveals the integration of spiritual practice with ordinary activities. His question wasn't separate from his farming, but another form of cultivation, tending to the quality of human connection just as carefully as he tended the rice plants. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck often spoke about the importance of being present with what is actually happening, rather than with our ideas about what should be happening. The conventional responses to "How are you?" often reflect our ideas about what others want to hear, rather than honest awareness of our current experience. The student's dance also demonstrates that authentic expression doesn't require sophisticated language or deep philosophical insights. Sometimes, a simple gesture that arises spontaneously from genuine presence communicates more effectively than elaborate verbal explanations. His backward hat and few dance steps revealed something real about his spirit in that moment. This teaching extends beyond verbal communication to all forms of expression. How often do we present ourselves according to learned templates, rather than allowing our authentic nature to show? Do our clothes express genuine preferences or social conformity? Does our behavior reflect conscious choice or unconscious habit? The master's delight in receiving an original response reveals the joy that emerges when human beings make authentic contact. Despite the simplicity of the exchange, something genuine passed between teacher and student that had been absent from all the previous interactions. This is what Zen calls direct transmission, understanding that moves from one awareness to another without relying on conventional forms. Buddhist meditation teacher Jack Cornfield writes about bringing beginner's mind to familiar experiences. The student who danced demonstrated this principle by treating a routine social question as if he had never heard it before, allowing fresh awareness to shape his response rather than relying on habitual patterns. The deeper invitation here involves developing comfort with not knowing how to respond before our authentic reaction reveals itself. The dancing student didn't plan his creative expression. He simply allowed sufficient space for something genuine to emerge, rather than rushing to fill the conversational gap with standard phrases. Tonight, as you reflect on your own patterns of communication, can you imagine treating casual questions as opportunities for authentic expression rather than obligations to provide expected answers? Perhaps you'll discover that even brief interactions can become gateways to greater self-awareness and more meaningful connection. As the Buddha observed, the tongue like a sharp knife kills without drawing blood. But the tongue can also heal, connect, and awaken when guided by presence rather than habit. Let us continue our journey with a story about the limits of intellectual understanding and the humility that true wisdom requires. This is the ultimate point. A learned Zen priest named Tai Gu had spent years studying sacred texts, mastering meditation techniques, and developing a reputation for spiritual insight. When the position of abbot became available at a respected temple, the community chose him, confident in his wisdom and abilities. Tai Gu accepted the role with pride, believing his years of preparation had equipped him for spiritual leadership. Soon after his appointment, a woman from the village approached the temple, her face etched with the deep grief of a mother who had lost her child. She bowed before the new abbot, her eyes filled with desperate hope. "Venerable Master," she said, her voice breaking, "I have heard of your great wisdom and compassion. My child has died, and my heart is shattered. Please, tell me where my child has gone. I need to know, where is my beloved child now?" Tai Gu sat in silence, his mind racing through all the Buddhist teachings he had memorized about death, rebirth, and the nature of existence. He had studied the complex doctrines of different schools, could quote countless sutras about the bardos and the cycles of karma, and had meditated on the impermanence of all phenomena. Yet faced with this mother's raw anguish and simple question, he found himself utterly speechless. The philosophical concepts that had seemed so clear in scholarly discussion suddenly felt hollow and inadequate. The woman's grief was immediate and real, while his understanding remained theoretical and distant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. How could he offer intellectual explanations to a heart torn apart by loss. The woman waited, her eyes searching his face for some comfort, some insight that might ease her unbearable pain. But Taigu remained silent, realizing with growing horror that despite all his study and supposed attainment, he had no authentic answer to offer her. Finally, the woman rose slowly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She bowed once more and walked away, leaving Taigu alone with the weight of his inadequacy. Her footsteps echoed in the temple hall long after she had gone. That night, Taigu sat in deep contemplation, his certainty about his spiritual development crumbling. "I thought I had attained realization," he whispered to himself. "I believed I understood the deepest truths of existence. But this woman's simple question has revealed that I know nothing about the ultimate point. What use is being an abbot if I cannot offer genuine comfort to someone who is suffering?" By morning, Taigu had made his decision. He removed his ceremonial robes, abandoned his prestigious position, and departed the temple to deepen his understanding of true compassion. As the Buddha observed, the greatest prayer is patience. What emerges from this story is a profound truth about the difference between intellectual knowledge and wisdom born from direct experience. Spiritual understanding that cannot meet human suffering with authentic presence serves no one, least of all ourselves. Why do we sometimes mistake scholarly knowledge for genuine wisdom? Zen Buddhism reveals several ways our minds create this confusion. We can become intoxicated by conceptual understanding, collecting spiritual ideas like trophies, while our hearts remain untouched by their deeper meaning. This intellectual accumulation gives us a false sense of advancement while leaving us unprepared for life's most challenging moments. We also develop what might be called premature certainty, the belief that because we can articulate spiritual truths, we have integrated them fully. Like a person who has read extensively about swimming but never entered the water, we might know all the theory while lacking practical skill when it matters most. Additionally, spiritual positions and titles can insulate us from the very experiences that would deepen our understanding. When people treat us as wise, we might begin to believe our own reputation rather than continuing to cultivate genuine insight. The abbot's role placed Taigu in a position where others expected him to have answers, but this expectation prevented him from acknowledging his actual limitations. Consider how this pattern appears in modern spiritual communities. Teachers might offer complex, philosophical explanations for suffering, while lacking the emotional availability to simply sit with someone in pain. Practitioners could master advanced meditation techniques while remaining impatient with family members. Students might accumulate spiritual concepts while their basic capacity for kindness remains undeveloped. The Zen master Yunmen taught, "If you walk, just walk. If you sit, just sit. But whatever you do, don't wobble." Taigu was wobbling between intellectual understanding and authentic realization. The grieving mother's question demanded presence, not philosophy. Compassion, not concepts. This doesn't diminish the value of spiritual study, but rather places it in proper perspective. Sacred texts and teachings serve as maps pointing toward direct experience, not substitutes for the journey itself. When we mistake the map for the territory, we become lost in abstraction while life's essential questions remain unanswered. The woman's question, "Where has my child gone?" cannot be answered adequately through doctrine or philosophy. It requires the kind of understanding that emerges only from confronting our own losses, sitting with our own grief, and developing the capacity to be present with suffering without needing to fix or explain it away. Taigu's decision to abandon his position demonstrates remarkable courage and authentic spiritual insight. Rather than defending his reputation or offering hollow comfort, he chose honesty about his limitations. This humility opened the door to genuine learning, while clinging to false certainty would have kept him trapped in spiritual pretense. The Buddha said, "Doubt everything, find your own light." True spiritual authority comes not from having all the answers, but from the willingness to remain present with life's deepest questions. Sometimes the most helpful response to someone's suffering is simply acknowledging that we don't know, but we're willing to sit with them in their pain. Tonight, as you reflect on your own spiritual understanding, can you distinguish between knowledge that lives in your head and wisdom that flows from your heart? Where might you be substituting concepts for genuine realization? What would it mean to approach life's ultimate questions with Taigu's hard-won humility? As the Buddha taught, it is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles. The conquest of false certainty opens the way to authentic wisdom. Now, let us explore a story about recognition and the wisdom hidden in plain sight. This is the lesson of the visitor and the holy man. Word had spread throughout the countryside about a remarkable holy man who possessed extraordinary wisdom and spiritual power. People said he could answer any question, solve any problem, and provide guidance that would transform the most troubled life. He lived, according to these stories, in a simple house high atop a mountain, far from the distractions and corruptions of ordinary village life. A man from the valley below had been struggling with a persistent problem that seemed to have no solution. He had tried everything he could think of, consulting friends, seeking advice from local elders, even visiting other teachers. But nothing had brought him the clarity or peace he desperately sought. When he heard about the holy man on the mountain, he knew he had to make the journey, no matter how difficult it might be. The path up the mountain was steep and treacherous. The man climbed for hours under the burning sun, his feet growing sore, his breathing labored, his water supply dwindling, but his determination never wavered. He was certain that once he reached the top and met this legendary figure, all his troubles would be resolved through the holy man's superior wisdom and spiritual insight. Finally, after a grueling climb that left him exhausted and dusty, he reached the simple house at the mountain's peak. The structure was modest and weathered, exactly what he had expected for someone who had transcended worldly concerns. He approached the door with a mixture of anticipation and reverence, preparing himself to meet someone who possessed wisdom far beyond that of ordinary people. When he knocked, an elderly servant answered. The man was plain and unremarkable, his clothes simple, his manner humble, his appearance entirely ordinary. He looked like any of a dozen servants the visitor might encounter in his own village. "I would like to see the wise holy man," the visitor said, barely glancing at the servant as he spoke. His eyes were already searching past the old man into the house, eager to catch a glimpse of the extraordinary being he had climbed so far to meet. The servant smiled warmly and gestured for him to enter. "Please, come inside," he said gently, leading the way through the modest dwelling. As they walked through the house, the visitor looked around eagerly, his heart racing with anticipation. He examined every room they passed, searching for signs of the holy man's presence, Perhaps special robes, sacred objects, or an aura of otherworldly peace. The servant continued to guide him quietly through the simple rooms, past basic furnishings and ordinary household items. Before the visitor quite realized what was happening, they had walked through the entire house and arrived at the back door. The servant opened it and gestured toward the path that led back down the mountain. The visitor stopped abruptly, confusion and disappointment washing over him. "Wait," he said, turning to face the servant with growing frustration. "I didn't come all this way to be escorted through an empty house. I want to see the holy man. Where is he?" The old servant's smile deepened, and his eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "You already have seen him," he said quietly. "But, more importantly, I have a teaching for you that will solve whatever problem brought you here today." The visitor stared at him, not understanding. This ordinary old man couldn't possibly be the legendary holy figure he had heard about. Where was the radiant presence, the obvious signs of spiritual attainment, the dramatic wisdom that everyone talked about? "Here is the teaching," the servant continued, his voice soft but carrying absolute conviction. "Everyone you meet in life, even if they appear plain and insignificant to you, see each of them as a wise, holy man or woman. If you can do this, if you can truly see the sacred in every person you encounter, then whatever problem you brought here today will be solved." Buddha's wisdom tells us, if you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. This tale unveils the profound truth that we find what we're prepared to see, and our capacity for recognition determines what wisdom becomes available to us. Why do we search for the sacred in special places and extraordinary people while overlooking the wisdom that surrounds us every day? Zen Buddhism points to our conditioning that associates spiritual truth with dramatic appearances, exotic circumstances, and obviously impressive figures. But the deepest teachings often come disguised as the most ordinary encounters. The visitor's problem wasn't really the external difficulty that brought him to the mountain. His deeper problem was his inability to recognize wisdom when it didn't match his preconceptions. He was so focused on finding someone who looked like his idea of a holy man that he almost missed the actual holy man standing right in front of him. Consider your own daily interactions. How often do you dismiss people because they don't seem impressive, educated, or obviously wise? The checkout clerk who greets you with genuine warmth, the janitor who works with quiet dignity, the child who asks innocent but profound questions. Any of these encounters might offer exactly the insight you need if you're prepared to receive it. This teaching transforms how we move through the world. Instead of searching for wisdom in special places or waiting for obviously enlightened teachers to appear, we begin to approach every person as a potential source of insight. The homeless person on the street, the difficult co-worker, even the family member who annoys us. Each becomes a teacher when we're ready to learn. Zen Master Dogen taught, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. When we truly see others as sacred, we naturally forget our own ego's need to feel superior or special. The visitor's disappointment came from his attachment to being someone who had access to exclusive wisdom rather than someone who could recognize wisdom everywhere. The Buddha said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared." Every person carries this same capacity to kindle understanding in others, but only when we approach them with the recognition that they might have something valuable to offer. Look deeply at your current relationships and daily encounters. Where might you be overlooking wisdom because it comes in an ordinary package? What would change in your interactions if you truly treated every person as someone who might be a disguised holy man or woman? Tonight, as you consider the various people in your life, family members, colleagues, strangers you encounter, can you practice the holy man's teaching? Can you look past surface appearances and social roles to see the deeper wisdom that every conscious being carries? Can you approach tomorrow's interactions with the recognition that your next teacher might be standing right in front of you, waiting to be seen? As the Buddha observed, in the sky, there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. The distinction between holy and ordinary, wise and simple, teacher and student exists primarily in our own minds. When we learn to see past these artificial categories, we discover that wisdom is everywhere, waiting patiently for our recognition. Let us now turn to a story about the relationship between outer circumstances and inner cultivation. This is the tale of the horse and the mind. In a remote mountain region where execution grounds served as sobering reminders of mortality, Zen master Bankai sought to test the depth of his spiritual realization. For several nights, he sat in meditation beneath a wooden crucifix, using the proximity of death to penetrate more deeply into the nature of existence. After completing this intense retreat, Bankai made his way to a nearby area where he could rest. He found a peaceful spot on an embankment surrounding a horse corral where he lay down to continue his contemplation under the open sky. As he rested there, absorbed in profound silence, a harsh sound shattered his peace. From within the corral came the violent sounds of a warrior brutally beating his horse. The animal's cries mixed with the sharp crack of a whip and angry shouts of a man losing control. Master Bankai observed this scene with growing concern. The warrior was clearly frustrated, taking out his inner turmoil on the innocent animal. Each blow seemed to make the horse more agitated, rather than more compliant, creating a vicious cycle of violence and resistance. Unable to remain silent, Bankai called out from his position. "Hey, what do you think you are doing?" The warrior, absorbed in rage, ignored the interruption and continued his harsh treatment. The beating intensified, and so did Bankai's concern for both the animal and the man degrading himself through such cruelty. "Hey!" Bankai called out again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years cultivating inner peace. "What do you think you are doing?" Still, the warrior continued, lost in frustration and anger. The horse became increasingly panicked, which only seemed to fuel the man's determination to force compliance through violence. A third time, Bankai's voice rang out. "Hey! What do you think you are doing?" This time, something in the master's tone penetrated the warrior's rage. The man stopped his beating, climbed down from his horse, and approached the embankment. As he drew closer, his expression changed. There was something about this stranger that commanded respect, a quality of presence that spoke of deep, inner development. "You were yelling at me," the warrior said, his voice still carrying traces of anger, but now mixed with curiosity. "Do you have something to tell me?" Bankai looked at the man with compassion, seeing not an enemy, but someone caught in the same cycles of frustration that trap us all. His response was simple yet profound. "Rather than beat your horse for being unruly, why not chastise yourself and train your own mind right?" The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge connecting two very different approaches to dealing with difficulty. The warrior had been trying to solve his problem through external force and control. Bankai was pointing to an entirely different possibility. As the Buddha observed, conquer anger with non-anger, conquer badness with goodness, conquer meanness with generosity, conquer dishonesty with truth. This teaching captures the essence of what Bankai offered the frustrated warrior. The recognition that our external struggles mirror our internal state. What emerges from this story is the profound insight that we cannot successfully force the world to conform to our expectations through aggression or control. The warrior's approach, beating the horse into submission, represents how we often try to manage difficult circumstances in our own lives. We become frustrated with external conditions and respond with force, criticism, or manipulation, never recognizing that the real work lies within. Why do we instinctively blame external circumstances for our frustration? Buddhist psychology explains that the untrained mind seeks to maintain its comfort by controlling its environment, rather than developing the flexibility to respond skillfully to whatever arises. This creates what Zen calls pushing the river, exhausting ourselves, trying to force reality to match our preferences. Consider how this pattern manifests in daily life. The computer that crashes during an important project becomes the target of our anger, when the real issue is our attachment to having technology work perfectly. The traffic jam that makes us late triggers road rage, when the actual problem is our expectation that travel should always be smooth. The family member who doesn't respond to our advice becomes the focus of our frustration, when the deeper issue is our need to control others' choices. In each case, we're like the warrior beating the horse, applying force to external circumstances while ignoring the internal conditions that create our suffering. The horse represents the uncontrollable aspects of life: other people's behavior, natural events, technological failures, and the inherent unpredictability of existence. Zen teacher Pema Chodron writes, "You are the sky, everything else is just the weather." This points to the same truth Bankai offered the warrior. Instead of trying to control the weather of external circumstances, we can develop the spacious awareness that remains calm regardless of conditions. The real training involves learning to work with our own minds, rather than trying to force compliance from the world around us. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations, but rather approaching challenges from a place of inner stability rather than reactive frustration. Buddhist practice offers specific techniques for this internal training. Mindfulness meditation teaches us to observe our reactive patterns without being swept away by them. Loving kindness practice develops compassion for ourselves and others when things don't go as planned. Contemplation of impermanence helps us accept the changeable nature of all conditions. Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable frustrations of daily life, can you remember Bankai's teaching? When you find yourself wanting to beat the horse of difficult circumstances, can you pause and ask, what would it mean to train my own mind instead? Buddha's wisdom teaches us, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. The path to peace lies not in conquering external conditions, but in cultivating the inner qualities that remain stable, regardless of what the world presents. Let us now turn to a story about the deceptive nature of appearances and the masks we wear in seeking acceptance. This is the tale of the hungry abbot and the generous robe. In a bustling merchant quarter of an ancient Chinese city, where silk traders and wealthy families built elaborate houses behind high walls, there lived a man whose prosperity was known throughout the region. His mansion boasted carved jade doorways, courtyards filled with exotic birds, and servants who attended to every detail of daily life. This man took great pride in his position and was particular about maintaining his reputation among other prominent citizens. One morning, as autumn rain fell steadily on the cobblestone streets, a figure approached his ornate front gate. The visitor was a Zen abbot from a mountain monastery, but he appeared as nothing more than a beggar. His simple brown robes were patched and worn thin from years of use. His sandals were cracked and muddy from walking mountain paths, and his wooden begging bowl showed the stains and scratches of countless meals received in charity. The abbot stood quietly at the gate, rain dripping from his shaved head, and waited with the patient dignity that comes from years of spiritual practice. When the gatekeeper finally noticed him, the man's expression immediately showed disdain. "What do you want, beggar?" the gatekeeper asked harshly, not bothering to bow or show any respect. "This is the house of an important man. We have no scraps for wanderers." "I am traveling and seeking alms," the abbot replied gently. "Perhaps your master would offer a simple meal to a monk." The gatekeeper looked him up and down with obvious contempt. These ragged clothes, this worn appearance. Clearly this was just another vagrant trying to take advantage of his master's household. "Be gone," he commanded. "My master does not waste food on beggars. Seek your charity elsewhere." The abbot accepted this rejection without anger or argument. He simply bowed, turned, and walked back into the rain, his empty bowl tucked beneath his arm. Several hours later, as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, the same figure returned to the same gate. But now everything had changed. The abbot wore his formal ceremonial robes, rich golden silk embroidered with intricate patterns, a magnificent purple sash across his shoulders, and prayer beads carved from precious wood. His bearing remained humble, but his appearance now spoke unmistakably of high spiritual rank and monastery wealth. This time, when the gatekeeper saw him approaching, his entire demeanor transformed. "Welcome, honored master," he exclaimed, bowing deeply. Please enter. My master will be so pleased to receive such a distinguished visitor." The rich man himself hurried out to greet the abbot personally, offering elaborate bows and flowery words of welcome. "Venerable sir, what an honor for our humble household. You must join us for our finest meal. Please allow us to serve you." They ushered the abbot into their most elegant dining room, where servants quickly prepared a sumptuous feast. Delicate fish, perfectly seasoned vegetables, fragrant rice, and sweet desserts filled the low table. The rich man sat opposite the abbot, beaming with pride at his ability to host such an important religious figure. As the first course was served, the abbot did something completely unexpected. Instead of eating, he carefully removed his beautiful ceremonial robe and folded it with great attention. Then, with deliberate precision, he placed the folded robe directly in front of the feast, as if it were the honored guest. Standing up with quiet dignity, the abbot spoke clearly so all present could hear. "This meal is not for me, it is for the robe." Without another word, he walked out of the house, leaving behind both the magnificent feast and the rich man's stunned realization of his own superficial judgment. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, judge not by appearances. A rich heart may be under a poor coat. Here we discover how our fixation on external appearances creates barriers to genuine human connection and spiritual understanding. Why do we judge others so quickly based on their clothing, status symbols, or outward presentation? Zen Buddhism points to our conditioned mind's habit of creating categories and hierarchies based on surface appearances. This mental shortcut allows us to feel we understand people without the more challenging work of seeing their true nature. The rich man's household represents a pattern we all recognize in ourselves. How differently do we treat the well-dressed stranger versus the poorly dressed one? How does our attention change when someone mentions their impressive job title versus their humble occupation? How does our respect shift when we learn someone's wealth or poverty? This ancient wisdom illuminates our tendency to project worth onto external symbols rather than recognizing the inherent dignity of every person. The abbot remained exactly the same person in both encounters. His wisdom, compassion, and spiritual realization unchanged by his clothing. Yet the household's treatment of him transformed completely, based solely on appearances. Look deeply at your own patterns of judgment. Perhaps you find yourself making assumptions about people in expensive cars versus old vehicles, designer clothes versus thrift store finds, prestigious addresses versus modest neighborhoods. Each of these judgments reveals how we've been conditioned to equate external appearance with internal worth. The story points us toward a fundamental question about authenticity. If we receive a different treatment based on our presentation, which version of ourselves is real? Are we the person in casual clothes running errands, or the person dressed professionally for important meetings? Are we the one seeking help, or the one offering it? In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called original face, the authentic self that exists beneath all roles, costumes, and presentations. This original face doesn't change whether we're wearing rags or ceremonial robes, whether others treat us with respect or dismissal. Zen Master Bankei taught, "Your original face is not born and does not die." This teaching invites us to recognize that our essential nature, our capacity for awareness, love, and wisdom remains constant, regardless of how others perceive us or how we present ourselves to the world. The abbot's teaching was not just for the rich man, but for all of us who might witness his story. By feeding the robe instead of himself, he revealed how often we relate to people's personas rather than their essence. We honor the title, the clothing, the symbols of status, while missing the actual human being present before us. Consider how this insight might transform your daily interactions. The server at your restaurant, the clerk at the store, the person asking for directions, each carries the same essential dignity as the most honored guest. The challenge is seeing past the uniforms, the circumstances, the social roles, to the original face beneath. This doesn't mean we ignore practical realities or social conventions, but that we hold them more lightly. We can acknowledge someone's professional role while remembering their fundamental humanity. We can dress appropriately for occasions while knowing our worth doesn't depend on our wardrobe. Tonight, as you consider the various roles and presentations you inhabit throughout the day, can you sense the unchanging awareness that witnesses all these temporary costumes? Can you feel the original face that remains constant, whether others see you as important or invisible? The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." The abbot's silent gesture spoke more powerfully than lengthy sermons about equality and compassion. By walking away from the feast, prepared for his appearance rather than his essence, he offered a teaching that continues to resonate across centuries. Let us explore a story about the profound distinction between spiritual authority and worldly power. This is the Emperor's Invitation. In the mountains of Japan, where ancient pines whispered secrets to the wind, lived Master Taigu, a Zen teacher whose realization had become legendary throughout the land. His understanding of the Dharma was so profound that even learned scholars would travel great distances just to sit in his presence for a few moments. Word of his wisdom eventually reached the retired Emperor Go-Mizunoo, a man accustomed to having the greatest minds of the realm summoned to his court. The emperor, intrigued by reports of this mountain sage, sent his most trusted messenger to Master Gudo with a request that Taigu be brought to the imperial palace for an audience. The invitation was presented with great ceremony, accompanied by silken scrolls and promises of honor. Yet when Master Gudo delivered this prestigious summons to Taigu, the master's response was immediate and unwavering. "I can be a host," Taigu declared simply, his eyes reflecting the same stillness as the mountain lake nearby. "I can never be a guest." The messenger, confused by this unexpected refusal, pressed the matter. "Master, do you understand? This is an invitation from the retired emperor himself, the greatest honor in the land." Taigu smiled gently. "That is precisely why I cannot accept. When one truly understands the Dharma, there is no position higher or lower. There is only the eternal host of truth, welcoming all who seek with genuine hearts." The emperor, upon hearing of this refusal, was initially puzzled, then impressed by the master's integrity. He did not extend the invitation again, recognizing something profound in Taigu's response. Years later, Master Taigu was heard to remark to his students, "Had I responded to the imperial summons, our school would likely have fallen into the dirt. True teaching cannot be commanded or displayed on demand." The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." What emerges from this story is a teaching about the incorruptible nature of authentic spiritual authority and the dangers of seeking validation from worldly power. Why do we so often compromise our deepest principles when offered recognition or status? Zen Buddhism reveals that this tendency stems from what is called gaining mind, the ego's constant hunger for external validation and advancement. This mindset transforms spiritual practice into a commodity to be traded for social position, wealth, or influence. Our culture particularly struggles with this dynamic. We live in a society that equates worth with achievement, recognition with reality, and external success with inner fulfillment. The spiritual path becomes another arena for competition, another way to accumulate impressive credentials or associations with powerful people. Consider how often we modify our authentic expression to gain approval from those we perceive as having authority over our lives. A teacher dilutes their message to avoid challenging students. An artist compromises their vision to secure a prestigious exhibition. A spiritual practitioner adopts fashionable teachings rather than following their genuine understanding. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi observed, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." When we become attached to being seen as experts, as people worthy of imperial invitations, we lose the fresh, humble awareness that allows genuine wisdom to flow through us. The deeper teaching here shows us that true spiritual authority cannot be granted by external sources, no matter how exalted. It arises naturally from direct realization and expresses itself through humble service to truth, rather than accumulation of prestigious positions. When we understand this, we become like Master Taigu, eternally the host, offering wisdom freely to sincere seekers while remaining unswayed by offers of worldly elevation. Taigu's refusal wasn't arrogance, but profound humility. He understood that the moment he accepted the role of court entertainer, performing wisdom for imperial approval, he would cease to be an authentic teacher and become merely another ornament of power. Tonight, as you reflect on areas where you might be seeking external validation for your inner work, can you identify where your authentic voice gets compromised for the promise of recognition? Can you find the courage to remain the host of your own truth, offering your gifts freely while staying unattached to how they are received by those in positions of worldly authority? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. True spiritual authority increases through generous sharing, not through association with power. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about how customs can outlive their purpose. This is the lesson of the monastery cat and the scholars who forgot. In a peaceful monastery nestled in the mountains, a community of monks dedicated themselves to regular meditation practice. Every evening, as the sun set behind the peaks and shadows grew long across the temple grounds, they would gather in the meditation hall for their most important practice session of the day. This was a time of deep silence and inner contemplation that had been maintained for generations. However, the monastery was also home to a particularly vocal cat who had made the temple grounds his territory. This cat had developed the unfortunate habit of appearing during the evening meditation sessions, meowing loudly, knocking over water bowls, and generally creating disturbances that made it difficult for the monks to maintain the focused attention their practice required. Night after night, the monks would attempt to settle into deep meditation, only to be interrupted by the cat's antics. Some tried to ignore the disruptions. Others attempted to gently shoo the animal away, but nothing seemed to work consistently. The cat seemed to have an uncanny ability to choose the most inopportune moments for his loudest and most distracting behavior. Finally, the spiritual teacher who led the community decided that practical action was needed. Rather than allowing the evening practice to continue being disrupted, he instructed his students to gently capture the cat before each meditation session and tie him securely in a corner of the hall where he could do no harm. This simple solution proved effective. The cat, though present, could no longer disturb the monks' concentration. Years passed peacefully with this arrangement. The evening meditation sessions proceeded without interruption. The monks deepened their practice, and the cat seemed content enough with his restrained position during the evening hours. This became the established routine that everyone accepted as normal and necessary. When the old teacher eventually died, the monks naturally continued all the practices he had established, including the evening tying of the cat. After all, this had been part of their master's wisdom, a tradition he had instituted for important spiritual reasons. They didn't question whether the practice was still necessary. It had simply become an integral part of their evening routine. In time, the original cat also died, having lived a full life in the monastery. The monks, now thoroughly convinced that having a tied cat was essential to proper meditation practice, went to great lengths to acquire another cat specifically for this purpose. They searched until they found a suitable replacement and continued the tradition without interruption. Generations of monks came and went, each learning from their predecessors that tying a cat during evening meditation was a crucial element of their spiritual practice. None questioned why this was necessary. It was simply how things had always been done in their tradition. Centuries later, learned descendants of the spiritual teacher wrote scholarly treatises about the religious significance of tying up a cat for meditation practice. They developed elaborate theories about the symbolic meaning of the restrained cat, its representation of taming the wild mind, and its importance in creating the proper spiritual atmosphere for contemplation. Buddha's wisdom teaches us, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. This tale unveils how easily practical solutions can transform into meaningless rituals when we stop questioning their original purpose. Why do we continue practices long after their usefulness has ended, simply because they've become traditional? Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of understanding the spirit behind forms, rather than blindly following inherited customs that may no longer serve their intended function. The original teacher's decision to tie the cat was purely practical, a simple solution to a specific problem. But over time, this practical measure became ritualized, then sacralized, then analyzed as if it contained profound spiritual meaning that had always been intentional. Consider the various traditions, rules, and customs in your own life, both personal and cultural. How many of these practices do you follow simply because that's how it's always been done, rather than because they serve a current purpose? The monastery's cat represents all the meaningless forms we maintain out of habit rather than wisdom. This teaching applies to spiritual practices, workplace procedures, family traditions, and social customs. Over time, solutions to specific problems can become rigid requirements that persist long after the original problems have disappeared. What began as skillful means becomes empty ritual. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between the finger pointing at the moon and the moon itself, between the forms that serve awakening and awakening itself. The tied cat was never the point. Peaceful meditation was the point. But succeeding generations lost sight of this distinction. The Buddha said, "My teaching is like a raft. It is for crossing over, not for holding onto." The cat-tying tradition represents what happens when we turn temporary rafts into permanent shrines, mistaking the means for the end. Look deeply at the various practices and traditions you maintain. Which ones still serve their original purpose, and which ones have become empty forms you follow out of habit? What would it mean to honor the spirit of these practices while remaining flexible about their forms? The scholars who wrote treatises about the cat's religious significance weren't intentionally creating false doctrine. They genuinely believed they were preserving important wisdom. But their analysis was built on a foundation they didn't understand, leading to elaborate explanations of something that had never been intended as spiritual practice. Tonight, as you consider the various routines, traditions, and practices in your life, can you remember the original cat and the practical problem it solved? Can you distinguish between forms that still serve their purpose and those that have become meaningless repetition? As the Buddha observed, believe nothing merely because you have been told it, but after observation and analysis, When you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. True spiritual maturity involves continuously examining our practices to ensure they serve their intended purpose, rather than simply preserving forms because they've become familiar. Let us now turn to a story about the most profound spiritual truth hiding in the most obvious place. This is the dialogue between Joshu and Nansen about the ordinary mind. In a quiet mountain monastery where morning mist drifted between ancient pine trees and the sound of temple bells echoed across distant valleys, two masters engaged in a conversation that would illuminate the very heart of Zen understanding. Joshu, despite his own considerable wisdom and years of practice, approached his teacher Nansen with the earnestness of a sincere student seeking to understand the deepest mysteries of existence. The two men sat facing each other in the temple's meditation hall, where countless seekers before them had wrestled with the same fundamental questions about the nature of awakening. Joshu's inquiry came from a place of genuine perplexity. After years of intensive practice, meditation, and study, he still felt uncertain about the very foundation of the spiritual path. "Master," Joshu began with characteristic directness, "what exactly is the way? With all our practices and teachings, what are we ultimately seeking?" Nansen's response was immediate and surprisingly simple. "Ordinary mind is the way," he replied, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. This answer clearly puzzled Joshu, who had expected something more esoteric, more complex, more removed from everyday experience. "If ordinary mind is the way," he pressed further, "then should we direct ourselves toward cultivating it? Should we make it our spiritual goal?" Nansen shook his head gently. "If you direct yourself toward it, you immediately go away from it," he explained. "The very effort to attain ordinary mind makes it extraordinary, and therefore no longer ordinary." Now Joshu found himself in what seemed like an impossible logical bind. "But Master, if we don't try to cultivate or attain anything, how can we ever know that this ordinary mind is actually the way? How can we recognize it without some form of practice or effort?" Nansen's final response cut through all philosophical complexity with razor-sharp clarity. "The way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. Knowing turns the way into a concept, an object of understanding, which is illusion. Not knowing turns it into blankness, which misses its vibrant presence. If you truly realize the way without doubt, it becomes like the great void, so vast and boundless that it contains everything. How then could there be any distinction between right and wrong, sacred and mundane, ordinary and extraordinary?" At these words, something shifted fundamentally in Joshu's understanding. The seeking mind that had been grasping for answers suddenly relaxed, and he experienced a moment of complete clarity. Not the clarity of understanding something new, but the clarity of recognizing what had been present all along. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, there is nothing to seek and nothing to find. Everything is already here. The heart of this lesson lies in recognizing that what we seek through spiritual practice is not some special state of consciousness, but rather the ordinary awareness that is reading these words right now. Why do we struggle to accept that ordinary mind is the way? Zen Buddhism points to our deep conditioning that spiritual truth must be extraordinary, mystical, or dramatically different from our everyday experience. We imagine enlightenment as a permanent state of bliss, cosmic consciousness or supernatural abilities, when in reality, it is simply the natural state of awareness without the overlay of seeking and striving. Our spiritual seeking often becomes its own obstacle. Like a person frantically searching for glasses while wearing them, we exhaust ourselves looking for something we already possess. The very effort to attain a special spiritual state creates the sense of separation between seeker and sought, between the ordinary self and some idealized, awakened self. Consider how your own mind works in this very moment. Thoughts arise and pass away. Sensations appear in your body. Sounds reach your ears. Emotions flow through your awareness. This natural functioning of consciousness, without any special effort or concentration, is what Nansen calls ordinary mind. It is already enlightened, not because it achieves some particular state, but because it is the very space in which all states appear and dissolve. Zen master Huang Po taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way, just like now, without seeking anything, without grasping after the fruits of Zen, just this mind that thinks and feels and perceives. This is Buddha." This ordinariness is precisely what makes it so difficult to recognize. We keep looking past it for something more impressive. The great void that Nansen mentions is not empty space, but rather the spacious awareness in which all experiences arise. Like the sky that remains unchanged whether filled with clouds or clear, this awareness remains constant through all the changing contents of experience. Joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, peace and agitation, all appear and disappear within this unchanging background of ordinary awareness. This understanding revolutionizes our approach to spiritual practice. Instead of trying to achieve some special state, we learn to recognize the awareness that is already present. Instead of seeking to transcend ordinary experience, we discover the extraordinary nature of ordinariness itself. The sound of rain becomes as sacred as temple bells. Washing dishes becomes as profound as formal meditation. In Japanese aesthetics, there is a concept called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence. This appreciation for the ordinary and imperfect reflects the same understanding that Nansen points toward. The way is not found in perfected states, but in the natural flow of life exactly as it is. Tonight, as you experience the simple fact of being aware of these words, aware of your breathing, aware of the sounds around you, can you recognize this ordinary awareness as what you have been seeking all along? Can you relax the effort to become something other than what you already are? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. The way is not a destination to reach, but the very ground you are already standing on. In accepting your ordinary mind as Buddha mind, you discover that the spiritual journey was never about going somewhere else, but about recognizing where you have always been. Now, let us explore a Zen story about the unexpected power that emerges from true humility. This is the tale of the monk whose greatest strength lay hidden beneath apparent weakness. Busugai was born into a family of renowned warriors, inheriting not only their fierce courage, but also their formidable physical power. Despite entering Buddhist orders at the tender age of 12, he never abandoned his martial training. Under monastic robes beat the heart of a fighter who had mastered archery, horsemanship, and every traditional combat art. His strength was legendary. It was said he could punch a hole through almost anything. The monks at his temple called him the monk with punching power. though few outside the monastery knew of his extraordinary abilities. During the turbulent mid-19th century, Japan was convulsed by civil unrest as old orders crumbled and new powers emerged. Into this chaos came a warrior band known as the New Elite, ambitious fighters who had come to Kyoto hoping to seize power in the changing political landscape. These men were crude, arrogant, and violent, terrorizing ordinary townspeople with their swagger and their swords. They considered themselves above both law and courtesy, taking what they wanted and harming anyone who opposed them. One afternoon, Butsugai was walking quietly through Kyoto's streets when the sound of clashing bamboo practice swords drew his attention. Following the noise, he found himself outside the New Elite's quarters, watching through a window as the warriors trained. His monk's curiosity about martial technique overcame his usual discretion, and he lingered to observe their methods. Several warriors noticed the raggedly dressed monk peering in at them. Angered by what they saw as spying, they stormed outside and surrounded him aggressively. "What do you think you're doing here?" they demanded. "Who gave you permission to watch our training?" Butsugai bowed humbly, his voice soft with apology. "Please forgive me, honored warriors. I am only a simple monk who has just come down from the mountains. I heard sounds of training and was curious. I meant no offense." The warriors exchanged knowing glances, seeing an opportunity for cruel entertainment. "Anyone who spies on our training must know something about martial arts," they declared with menacing grins. "We insist that you demonstrate your skills. Come inside and face us." Despite his protests, Butsugai could not refuse without seeming cowardly. Reluctantly, he followed them into their training hall, where eager warriors began taking up bamboo swords to test this apparently helpless monk. What happened next astonished everyone present. Without showing the slightest alarm or aggression, Butsugai took his iron ceremonial scepter, a ritual object no one would have considered threatening, and began defending himself. Each warrior who attacked found his bamboo sword smashed to pieces by the monk's precise, effortless movements. One after another they came, and one after another their weapons were destroyed. Within minutes, several dozen elite fighters had been overcome by a single ragged monk who seemed barely to be trying. The sound of combat drew the attention of Kondo Isamu, the leader of the New Elite, and a warrior of fearsome reputation. Stepping into the training hall with a spear in his hands, he announced, "Your skills are too much for these young knights, monk. But now I, Kondo Isamu, challenge you to face a real master. They call me a genius of the martial arts." Suddenly, Butsugai's entire demeanor changed. His eyes went wide with terror, and he threw himself to the ground in abject prostration. "Kondo Isamu!" he cried out. "I have heard your legendary name. Your reputation as a martial genius is known throughout Japan. A wandering monk like me could never hope to stand against someone of your incredible skill. Please, have mercy and let me go." This display of apparent cowardice only emboldened Kondo further. "Stand up and fight," he commanded. "I won't let you leave after such a demonstration. Prepare yourself." Forced into the confrontation, Butsugai reluctantly rose to his feet, still trembling with seeming fear. When Kondo offered him proper weapons, a bamboo sword or wooden spear, Butsugai shook his head. "As a Buddhist monk, I should not take up weapons of violence. This ceremonial scepter will have to suffice." Kondo pressed him further, insisting that the monk arm himself properly for their duel. Growing desperate, Butsugai reached into his traveling pouch and withdrew 2 simple wooden begging bowls, gripping one in each hand. "Very well," he said to the astonished warrior chief. "These will have to do. Please, go ahead and try to spear me if you can." This apparent insolence infuriated Kondo beyond measure. Here was a trembling monk claiming he could defend himself against a master spearman using nothing but eating bowls. The warrior's face flushed with rage as he gripped his weapon, determined to end this mockery with a single devastating thrust that would shatter the monk's ribs. For nearly half an hour, Kondo stood motionless, his spear poised, studying his opponent with unblinking intensity. He was looking for the perfect opening, the moment of vulnerability that would allow him to strike with overwhelming force. But somehow, no matter how carefully he observed, he could find no gap in the monk's unusual defense. Finally, convinced he had spotted his opportunity, Kondo unleashed every ounce of power and rage he possessed in one tremendous spear thrust aimed directly at Butsugai's chest. The attack came with the speed of lightning and the force of a mountain avalanche. But Butsugai moved with even greater speed and impossible agility. Slipping the attack by mere inches, he immediately caught the spear shaft between his two wooden bowls, clamping it in a grip so powerful that it became absolutely immovable. The bowls, simple objects meant for collecting food donations, had become an unbreakable vice. Kondo pulled and pushed with all his might, his face turning red with exertion, sweat pouring down his brow. He twisted the spear this way and threw his entire body weight against it, but could not free his weapon from the monk's impossible grip. The harder he struggled, the more securely trapped his spear became between those ordinary begging bowls. After allowing this futile struggle to continue for some time, Butsugai suddenly released the spear with a piercing shout that seemed to shake the very walls. The abrupt release sent Kondo tumbling backward with such force that both he and his spear flew 20 or 30 feet across the training hall. Kondo lay stunned for a moment, then slowly rose to his feet. All his arrogance had evaporated. Bowing deeply to Butsugai, he spoke with genuine humility and respect. "Your skills are truly extraordinary, far beyond anything I have ever encountered. Who are you, really?" "I am simply a wandering monk named Butsugai," came the quiet reply. "So you are the famous monk with a punch," Kondo exclaimed, finally understanding who he had been facing. From that moment forward, he treated his former opponent with the greatest reverence. Word of this encounter spread throughout the ancient capital, and Butsugai's reputation grew far beyond the monastery walls. Yet when he completed his Zen studies and went into seclusion to deepen his realization, he showed no interest in fame or worldly success. Soon, however, people began gathering around him to study both Zen and martial arts, drawn by his unique combination of spiritual wisdom and physical mastery. A young swordsman once sought him out, asking for instruction. When Butsugai inquired about his purpose, the young man gave a remarkable answer: "I have come to die at the teacher's fists." Impressed by this attitude of total surrender, Butsugai allowed the swordsman to stay and presented him with a verse to contemplate. Even the power of the howling spirit, a single layer of mosquito netting. Through meditation on this paradoxical teaching, the young man eventually achieved deep understanding of what he called the hidden essence of jiu-jitsu, the gentle art. He later became renowned throughout Western Japan, always crediting Butsugai's verse for his insight. Despite receiving invitations from major barons who offered him the finest temples and luxurious accommodations, Butsugai remained in a poor temple until his death, wearing simple clothing and living contentedly on the bare necessities, never seeking anything beyond what he needed. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, the sage does not attempt anything very big and thus achieves greatness. Here we discover how true power often conceals itself behind apparent weakness, and how genuine humility can be the most potent force of all. Why do we associate power with aggression and dominance, rather than with skillful restraint? Our conditioning teaches us that strength must be displayed to be real, that victory requires the humiliation of opponents, that true mastery announces itself loudly. Butsugai's example reveals the profound difference between force and power, between conquest and mastery. This tale unveils the sophisticated strategy that emerges from genuine spiritual development. Butsugai's apparent terror before Kondo wasn't cowardice, but tactical brilliance. By allowing his opponent to become overconfident and enraged, he created the very conditions that made victory possible. His humility wasn't weakness, but the highest form of martial intelligence. The transformation from iron scepter to wooden bowls represents something profound about authentic spiritual power. The scepter, a symbol of religious authority, worked effectively against the ordinary warriors. But when facing the master, Butsugai instinctively reached for the most humble tools of his trade, begging bowls that represented his dependence on others' generosity. These simple objects became more powerful than any weapon, demonstrating that true strength emerges not from hardness, but from flexibility, not from aggression, but from responsiveness. Consider how often in your own life you might achieve more through strategic vulnerability than through displays of force. How many conflicts could be resolved more elegantly through apparent yielding than through direct confrontation? What would shift if you trusted that your genuine humility might be more influential than your attempts to prove your strength or correctness? Butsugai's verse about the mosquito netting points to the deepest level of this teaching. Even the most overwhelming force can be neutralized by the gentlest, most flexible response. A mosquito net stops insects not through hardness, but through appropriate positioning. Water defeats rock not through aggression, but through persistent gentleness. True martial arts, like authentic spirituality, finds the path of least resistance that accomplishes the greatest good. Zen master Takuan taught, the mind that is anxious to win will meet with certain defeat. Butsugai's victory came not from wanting to defeat anyone, but from responding appropriately to each moment. Against the ordinary warriors, appropriate response meant efficient defense. Against their leader, it meant appearing weak until the perfect moment for revelation. The young swordsman's declaration that he came to die at the teacher's fists represents the attitude that authentic learning requires, the willingness to let our false confidence, our ego's need to appear strong, our attachment to seeming invulnerable, all be destroyed in encounter with genuine mastery. Tonight, as you reflect on your own relationship to strength and weakness, can you sense the difference between power that needs to prove itself and power that serves from concealment? Can you feel how your genuine humility might be more transformative than your attempts at impressiveness? As the Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the gentlest response carries the greatest power to transform conflict into understanding. Tonight, as we gently close this shared experience, can you feel how the calm you've discovered isn't something borrowed or temporary, but something that has always belonged to you? Can you sense that the deep quiet you've touched tonight doesn't live only in these ancient tales, but rests naturally in your own awareness, patiently waiting for you to remember it's there. The Buddha reminded us, the way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart. Reflecting on this timeless wisdom, notice how tranquility and understanding don't require perfect conditions or special techniques, but bloom naturally from within your own being, available in any moment you choose to turn inward. Throughout tonight's journey, each tale has whispered the same profound truth in different ways. That struggle softens when we stop fighting what is. That freedom emerges naturally when we let go of what we cannot control. And that genuine peace arises from seeing clearly, beyond our stories and reactions. Even if your thoughts wander tomorrow, even if worry tries to return, the understanding you've absorbed tonight has taken root in the depths of your mind, ready to steady you whenever you need it most. Consider, as you prepare for rest, that these ancient teachings have revealed not some distant wisdom, but a way of being fully present right where you are. In the stillness that follows, allow yourself to notice how your breathing has deepened, how your body has settled, and how your mind now rests untroubled and clear. These stories are gentle reminders that true understanding isn't hidden in distant places or complex philosophies. It lives quietly in the simple act of paying attention to this moment, exactly as it is. Tonight, you've touched that truth, a truth that becomes visible when we pause and really listen. As you carry this peaceful energy back into your everyday world, take with you not just the tales themselves, but the deep calm and clarity they've awakened in you. May this tranquility remain close by, lighting your path through whatever tomorrow may bring. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us on this journey at Sleepy Monk.